Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about political ecology, or as I'm putting it here, culture and ecology don't exist in a happy little vacuum. So for the past several weeks, we've been talking about first, a foundational paradigm of sort of culture ecology and adaptation. And so thinking of culture and ecology issues through the lens of how cultures become finely tuned in their subsistence and different things to their lands. And then the last several weeks, we were also talking about another sort of foundational paradigm of knowledge systems, things like ethnoecology and spiritual ecology, sort of how cultures become deeply connected to their landscapes and talk about their landscapes. One issue that has come up several times, but which we have yet to really overtly address, is the way in which political systems fundamentally structure and influence culture's environmental dynamics, that it is not just how a culture has developed knowledge about a landscape or how they emotionally connect to a landscape, that it is not just how a culture adapts to its landscape, because cultures, quote unquote, societies, are never existing in a vacuum. And certainly nowadays, in our globalized, politically and economically interconnected world, they're most definitely not in a vacuum. The things that happen in one space inevitably affect many other spaces. We cannot think of something like, in the reading that you did, the phosphorus mining in Tunisia and the incredible effects that that has locally in terms of hypoxic zones and different things. We cannot think of that solely in terms of local Tunisians' understanding of phosphorus and of those bodies of water. We cannot think of it solely in terms of environmental adaptation. We can only make sense of that situation in light of a global economic order since the 1800s that relies upon a whole lot of phosphorus for fertilizers. So with all of that in mind, then let's get talking about political ecology. So this is the PowerPoint slide. I try to be good with these PowerPoint slides. I try to come up with good PowerPoint slides. I know we all have death by PowerPoint all the time. So I typed in like dynamic, and this is one of the ones that came up, and I really liked it. Although they had this like random stock photo of this lady in this picture, and I was like, that's kind of random and like looks overly cheery and optimistic for a lecture on political ecology where things are going to get pretty serious. So I decided to replace it with one of the villains from Captain Planet. I don't know if you ever watched Captain Planet as a kid. I sure did. I get the feeling that maybe we especially did in Oregon, that this was being like force fed to us because Oregon's such a sort of green place. But anyways, in the TV show Captain Planet, you have the character Captain Planet, who is a green-haired, blue-skinned, very strong pro-environmental superhero who was summoned by 5 people with power rings. And what always got me about that show, other than the very overtly multi-national cast, which was an interesting sort of thing for the time period. But the other thing that always got me about that show that was sort of different was the villains. They always seemed to me, and maybe I just didn't understand the plots as a kid, but it always seemed to me like the polluters didn't even have a super good reason to be polluting. Like it seemed like this dude was just like laughing about polluting for polluting's sake. They even kind of made him look like demonic or something. So, or like a creature from another dimension with the ears. And so, yeah, like what was his end game here? Like, why was he even polluting? I feel like it was just for fun. But of course, in real life, that's not really quite how it works at all. Instead, when we talk about something like pollution, when we talk about something like toxic waste, we are talking about complex issues with a lot of different political economic actors involved, many of which might have what they consider to be really good reasons for what they're doing. We're also talking about groups that are trying to rapidly accumulate profit. We were talking about just a lot. We were talking about government regulations, we're talking about all sorts of different things. So political ecology then. Let's talk about power and power relationships. Let's talk about Standing Rock to start this discussion. So many of you, I would assume, followed this news story about 6 years ago now. I can't believe the way the time is flying. Of course, in some ways this is ongoing, but the Dakota Access Pipeline, a major pipeline for oil, of course, and many people felt, so in the environmental impact statement process, which you're reading a bit about this week with the NEPA document, there is the they had different alternatives that were envisioned. So one was that the pipeline would go here, like closer to Bismarck, but instead where they routed it was this way, which eventually goes through Lake Oahe. And so many people presented that as an environmental racism situation, a situation of disproportionate environmental impact upon Native people because it is immediately next to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, a Lakota reservation, which historically in that area has quite a bit of poverty issues. And again, kind of both a class and race issue going on. People felt like they relocated it from Bismarck to get it away from a white area. Indeed, I wrote a piece about that. Whether or not that is how you choose to see that situation, it is the case that there was all sorts of politics involved with this. If we were to try to understand this topic and try to understand what's going on here in terms of culture and ecology, with the Dakota Access Pipeline and with the huge protests, we had months-long demonstrations, people blockading roads, people willing to even go to detention, to jail, people blocking the path of the construction. When you look at something like that, we can kind of look at multiple angles, right? There's the angle we've taken the last few weeks of ethnoecology, spiritual ecology, right? Lake Oahe is a traditionally sacred area for Lakota people, as is the Cannonball River and the Sacred Stones area, as it's called. So these are sacred areas. We could also think about it in terms of people's general views on resource extraction from a sacred ecology perspective and the way that that impacts the earth, the sacred earth, and certainly Lakota traditional spirituality has a lot to say about the sacredness of not just the land in general, but of specific natural entities. We could also take it from a cultural ecology and adaptation perspective, like we did at the start of this course. And we could think about this in terms of sort of a group of people who traditionally were nomadic bison hunters, and have since then been confined to a much smaller area that does not allow that for a way of life, and besides which most of the bison were killed off. And then we can think of that in terms of we can think of it in terms of adaptation to water and the way in which people depend upon these water bodies for their drinking water. Where the pipeline would go through is about a half mile up from where these folk reservation are, and also where a lot of the drinking water is coming from. But what would those perspectives not tell us, right? I think there's still a lot that's left unsaid with those perspectives. Among other things, one of the things that it wouldn't tell us, or one of the things that those perspectives don't bring attention to, is the kind of broader political economic order that informs this. Why is there a pipeline going in place to begin with? This is a story that involves oil companies. It's a story that involves both Canada and the US. It's a story that involves suburban sprawl and the way in which our cities are very much built around needing to drive around them, as opposed to how it used to be there used to be much more prominent public transportation in a lot of communities in the US. There's a lot of political economic forces driving the need for oil, as well as the export of oil to other countries, which is part of what this would have been involved in and is involved in. There are corporate interests. There is a United States government that has certain policies, some of which very much work against oil development and some of which very much expedite oil development. So there's all sorts of politics and economics for the why of this, as well as a broader history of resource colonialism that Lakota people have been subjected to historically and have resisted, such as the drive to take Lakota lands for gold mining out of the Black Hills, also sacred land. So you cannot tell this story completely without considering power as a dimension. So political ecology. Political ecology, we talk about, at the start of this class, we talked about kind of our concept of theory and theory as a lens. And I'll refer to political ecology as a theory, although it's less so a single theory as it is kind of an overall orientation towards looking at culture and ecology that has gained sway starting in the 70s is when we really started to see a lot of it, and has since then really become, I would argue, the dominant paradigm in environmental anthropology. A lot of people mix and blend other perspectives as well, but I would say there's very few people who do their work without considering the political context. And you could go to, for example, journals that are entirely devoted to political ecology, such as the Journal of Political Ecology, which is a great journal, an open source journal, which I really appreciate, but also a strongly peer-reviewed one. And which, take a given issue, and you've got all sorts of different articles. So that was 2022. 2021, all sorts of different articles on everything from hydrocarbon extraction in Ghana to the way in which oyster seamen, quote unquote, or fishers that are doing aquaculture do their work in Chesapeake Bay, I think is where they were doing that study, as well as things such as Colombia and coal mining. So, right, these kinds of studies are done, tons and tons and tons of them nowadays. Political ecology is definitely kind of a predominant, again, I wouldn't call it even a theory so much as just an overall orientation towards taking power into account when we look at culture and ecology. When it was initially proposed, I would say that a lot of political ecologists saw the theory as the basic idea that power and power inequalities drive, or at least significantly influence, the fate of environmental issues and natural resource conflicts. And so that's kind of an underlying idea there. And the relationship between a political economy and environment. If you've never studied the term political economy, it's sort of a fancy way of acknowledging the fact that when we say politics and when we say economics, those are obviously intimately interconnected, right? When we're talking about something like Dakota Access Pipeline, we have to take into account the Army Corps of Engineers, who played a really prominent role in that whole battle, as well as various land management agencies that allow for or restrict oil drilling and transportation. Political ecology work can be very, very local or very, very global, right? It can focus on some very small scale things, but usually it does have a definitely global component to it, because most parts of the world nowadays, when we start talking about political factors, we're talking about global markets, or at the very least national markets. So for example, one book that I would recommend to you is the book Friction by ANTH. It's a kind of modern classic in environmental anthropology. And a lot of that is about how logging in Southeast Asia and what that actually looks like on the ground and the profound cultural impacts it has. But a lot of that work, and also work by other people who've done logging in that region, logging research, such as Rochus, a lot of that work kind of draws attention to the way in which global markets are always inherently a part of that conversation. The wood, the lumber is not just sort of going towards local ends. And also it's driven by national politics and governments wanting to be profitable, wanting to be able to balance their budgets, wanting to stay in power, certain politicians. And so, yeah, it's one of those kinds of things where it's both very local and very global. It's often where we see the global playing out in the local. There's a quote by Christian Palmer in the reading that I had you do that I think sums up this kind of body of work well. He says, political ecology's primary message, by the way, as the meme suggests, I'm making you do the reading now by reading the required reading to you. It says, political ecology's primary message is the importance of examining environmental questions that seem at first glance to be strictly scientific, i.e. apolitical. So part of what I think he's getting at there, as the reading suggested, is studies that look at environmental issues from a purely sort of wildlife and soil and plant perspective, right? If we were to look at, for example, the Bristol Bay issue and the Pebble Mine issue, right? And solely look at it from a perspective of, okay, well, what's the likelihood that tailings from the mine would impact water quality? What would the water quality impacts be? And how would that affect salmon? Those are all sort of, quote, strictly scientific questions. But as political ecology points out, as Christian Palmer's pointing out, that's hardly an apolitical question, right? There's a reason that we're even talking about doing a mine there to begin with. And there's a reason also that that's not a question that is entirely decided by local Alaska Native residents to begin with, or local fishers. So he says, political ecology's primary message is the importance of examining environmental questions that seem at first glance to be strictly scientific or apolitical. That also speaks to not just the way in which we sometimes apoliticize or forget the politics behind environmental studies, but also the politics behind anthropological studies of culture and ecology. So for example, back to the Roy Rappaport study that you did, that we talked about with the Tsemberg and the pig populations. That was a fantastic study, really well done. Rappaport was obsessively detailed and did great research. Having said that, many people critiqued Rappaport for the fact that he was considering the Tsemberg in kind of isolation when they were already being impeded upon by global market forces. And indeed, that has only become more so the case over time with New Guinean groups. Sort of one of the last groups to experience rampant colonialism, but one that increasingly we're seeing more and more mining activity in the highlands and things like that. So few, if any, groups at this point are isolated from global markets or global political trends. And so increasingly anthropologists in the 1970s and 1980s and other social scientists started to more and more feel like they could not just do a research study of, for example, how a group adapts to their environment without considering political and historical changes and factors in that equation. Another example would be studies of ethnoecology, like that one we talked about with Harold Conklin, and how he showed that slash and burn horticulturalists were, surprise, surprise, actually very knowledgeable about their landscape and were not just doing recklessly irresponsible things. But and that was great research in the 1950s, but any conversation now of slash and burn horticulture inevitably leads us to also conversations of slash and burn pastoralism, or the things that are going on in the Amazon, and the way in which sometimes slash and burn agriculture and pastoralism, cutting down, burning, and then using either for more intensive farming or for running cattle for meat for global markets, that all of that has a political context, right? Of the Amazon becoming much more heavily populated and much more drawn into larger networks of finance and capital. So again, the idea that we can't look at things, or at least we shouldn't only think of things from a perspective of ethnoecology or cultural ecology, that also political stuff helps predict and affect how environmental situations will go down. He says questions of cause and effect, for instance, are comprised of political and economic agendas that can be masked by a seemingly neutral language of scientific objectivity. By focusing our attention on the power dynamic and political dimensions of conservation, principally in the developing world, political ecologists illustrate why conservation efforts so often fail to achieve the desired goals. Part of what he's getting at is situations in which, in the quote developing or global south world, you have areas, wide percentages of areas in many countries that have been set aside for conservation, but poaching still occurs, or areas where people from the global north, to be blunt, pressure nations in the global south, like, oh, don't deforest these specific areas, or let's do a sustainable timber kind of initiative to try to make sure that the wood that we're buying is sustainable. And yet these programs are sometimes not very successful, and why, or they're resisted, and why. And there's a lot of politics to that. And there's groups that are trying to economically develop in a global world order that to some degree has left them behind over the years. And so there's a lot to consider with why conservation programs that on first blush might seem like really good ideas, why those aren't always as successful as we'd like them to be, or who gets to define success. So that's part of what we're getting at. A bit of history, as I was suggesting there, tends to be problem focused, looking at things that have gone wrong, although not always, but things like pollution, things like resource extraction in its more extreme forms in the global south, but not always. Some of it's more mundane matters of sort of resource extraction when it's going well, when nobody has a particular problem with it. Also, since the 70s, especially in the wake of theorists like Michel Foucault, who talked a lot about knowledge power, oh, I'm sorry. I was supposed to, at this point, go honk, honk, honk as an indication to anybody that's not super into theory, or maybe not super interested in something like graduate studies and social sciences, let you know that you can kind of briefly ignore, because I'm going to go on like a theory digression right now that I'm not necessarily going to test you on. So I'll say honk, honk, honk again when you have to pay attention for the test again. So honk, honk, honk. A bit about theory. The 1970s saw the rise of a lot of both feminist scholarship in anthropology, basically like, oh gosh, male anthropologists have been mainly speaking to dudes and have therefore given us very skewed views of certain topics in anthropology, such as hunting and such as gender relations. So you had the rise of feminist scholarship. You also had the rise of post-structuralist scholarship, people like Michel Foucault, people like Pierre Bourdieu, people that were questioning, and then also the rise in that vein of science and technology studies, people like Bruno Latour, but a lot of different people in the 70s, 80s, 90s in the social sciences that were training their lens on science itself, right? In the 50s, 60s in environmental anthropology, a lot of it was looking more and more and more like anthropology was going to be a hard science, right? You read Roy Rappaport's stuff and it's all very quantified, very specific. Let's measure out the individual calories that people are gaining and losing to the ecosystem and stuff like that. And in the 70s, in anthropology as a whole, and really the social sciences as a whole, people started to really question hard sciences and the scientific approach that the social scientists have been modeling themselves after, and say, there's a lot of power in science and in knowledge and the academy in general, and ways in which that's sometimes been used for the powerful or distorted by the powerful. Knowledge power, as Foucault says, right? The way in which knowledge is used as a form of power. The more you know about a situation, the better you can regulate it or control it. The way in which discourses structure how research goes forward. I say all that, and you start to think, oh man, is Dunstan going on some anti-science kick and he's about to deny the reality of global warming or COVID or something? And that nothing could be further from the truth. I'm a big proponent of the scientific method and believer in good science. I'm just showing that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you had to push back against the idea that science was acultural, that there wasn't cultural and political dimensions to what gets focused on and what doesn't. Not that there's no validity to it, but just to be aware that knowledge started to be thought of in terms of how does knowledge actually get used once it leaves the laboratory, so to speak. How do people use knowledge, and how is knowledge produced and replicated and circulated? So that became a big part of political ecology as well, thinking through ecological issues, again, not as a purely scientific enterprise that we can just study with wildlife biology and soil science and things, but also one where we have to think about political and economic dimensions and why we're even having these conversations to begin with, right? Why are we even having a conversation about wildlife, or the politics of why and how certain types of pollution get regulated and certain types don't, right? Why do we have really good laws for something like water pollution and very little on something like noise pollution at the federal level? So anyways, honk, honk, honk. All right, that theoretical sort of digression is over. But my point here is we started to see the rise of political ecology really in the 70s, and at this point it's very influential. And I want to, and part of that reflects the fact that the 70s saw the rise of things like global environmentalism as a much more powerful force, and people kind of losing some of their optimism and starting to realize that there was some pretty serious environmental crises going on that needed to be addressed, and people agitating and pushing for change. And that's when a lot of our big environmental policies were passed in the US and in other countries as well. And so it's not shocking that political ecology became a big thing around this time as sort of a framework of let's look at power and economy in relation to culture and ecology. One of the first persons to kind of push forward that body of scholarship, by the way, was a guy by the name of Eric Wolf. Eric Wolf was an interesting guy. He served in the military in the 40s and was stationed in Italy during World War II, and eventually came back there to do field work. He specifically, along with John Cole, wrote a book called The Hidden Frontier, which kind of expanded on some of Wolf's earlier research, where he looked at two farming villages, both in the Italian Alps, St. Felix and Tret, which are literally a mile from each other. Their ecology is essentially identical. So from a cultural ecology perspective, a culture responds to the environment perspective, we should expect that the way they farm to be basically identical. However, one is Italian speaking, one is German speaking. It's right at the edge zone between Italy and Germany, the edge cultural zone. So Wolf kind of saw this as an example. Well, then though saw this not just as a cultural difference, but also a political difference. You had German governance system, a central governance system here that had always emphasized local community autonomy and control. And we can trace that all the way back to sort of German city-states long before Germany became a cohesive entity. And then Italy, Southern Europe kind of system that had very much grown out of the Roman Empire period, and where small villages were very much connected to bigger centers of power. And, part of what they noticed is that in their studies is that people in the German speaking village that were more influenced by this history of German politics and cultural ideals, very much focused on sort of a farm as a singular entity that was passed down to the oldest child, and was cohesive, where as Sorry, I was like, have a random stop of the audio there because I wanted to look over at a Wikipedia page to make sure that I was summarizing the study right. See how that works? You're not allowed to cite Wikipedia, but I'm allowed to refer to Wikipedia when I'm making sure I didn't foul up a detail in a lecture. Anyways, Eric Wolf, yes, I had it right. I'm remembering the case study correctly. So in the German situation, then you had, again, small or farms were a cohesive entity. In the Italian speaking village, instead farms got divided out to multiple different people, much more componentially, much more parceled out, even among the children and among the village as a whole. So two very different ways of farming: big farm, small farm, distributed out among many people, held by one person who's working with several others. And they relate that back to differences of, again, the idea of self-sufficiency as a cultural ideal reflecting sort of German political history versus the sense of being brought into broader networks, as well as the ways in which military members would sometimes visit by the empire and help with farming, visit from the empire or literally from Italian centers of power. So huge differences that had a lot more to do with ethnicity and culture, and especially political histories, than they had to do with any sort of different environment, right? It's not that one was a better form of farming than the other in that landscape. They both worked pretty well, but two very different ways of farming. So take that concept, extrapolate it out. What Eric Wolf talks about is we need to combine our inquiries into multiple local ecological contexts with a greater knowledge of social and political history, the study of intergroup relations in wider structural fields. So wider structural fields, right? This concept that people's local villages, even something as seemingly isolated as a small Italian Alps village, is not isolated from larger political trends, such as the Roman Empire going back hundreds of years, right? He also, another way he puts it is that the local customs of land inheritance, quote, mediated between the pressures emanating from the larger society and the exigencies of the local ecosystems. So you can see in political ecology, then we're not abandoning cultural ecology, right? The environment still pushes up and has an effect on how people adapt. It's not as if there's like, you can just, it's a free for all of how you adapt and that the politician tells you to do X when only Y is possible. Well, actually, sometimes we do that and then we end up with really stupid, unsustainable systems. The environment will push back, right? Life will find a way, as Ian Malcolm says. But at the same time, there are these bigger pressures that are pushing down and then giving you kind of the messy situation on the ground, the friction, as Anna Singh would say. To put that in maybe a more simplified way with a visual model, you have the local environment, of course, and you have the culture, of course, as cultural ecology and ethnoecology recognized very well, but then you have broader social pressures, broader economic and political forces. I'm going to share several examples of that. So my Eric Wolf example was example number 1. Example number 2 has disappeared on me, unfortunately, but allow me to share example number 3 then, political ecology of power mattering and pushing alongside local environment to affect something. So let's talk about Easter Island and Rapa Nui. So traditionally, this culture on Easter Island had produced these very large stone heads or moai. And yet when European explorers discovered this during the waves of colonization, they were surprised to find these elaborate stone sculptures, but almost no trees on the island, bushy trees that were like small, but no true trees, no true forests, mostly grassy ecosystem. And very few large animals to eat, a lot of relying on very small kinds of animals to eat, as well as a lot of marine resources instead. It was clearly an island that looked different from a lot of other islands and had clearly undergone some kind of deforestation. Over time, the picture that archaeologists and soil scientists and others have been able to piece together from looking at how, for example, swamp soil to look at like how pollen has changed over time. So that basically gives you an indirect way of looking at how the forest cover has changed over time. One of the things that has been able to be determined from that and from archaeology and from oral history, talking to local people, is that these moais were constructed in part using trees. They're not made out of wood, but people used the wood as rollers, apparently, and also as ropes. They would use it for the fiber for the ropes, and they would move these from the quarries, from the stone quarries across the island to the different places where they were going. And that was a very lumber intensive process where you had to roll them along these rollers because they're way too heavy to be lifted by a group of human beings and along with these ropes. What were the moai being produced for, though? They served no utilitarian purpose that we can tell. They weren't being used as any sort of direct farming thing. Instead, this appears to have been, and there's been some pushback on this idea over time, including by some people in the community there. So I don't want to say this is the only potential explanation, but the explanation that most scholars seem to have pushed towards is the idea that this was driven by elites, that the oral history seems to suggest that these moai were used as a way of talking about one's lineage, specifically if you were an elite family, sort of a chiefly family. It was a way of discussing one's lineage and of also one's sort of sacred lineage and connection to power. So a status symbol with a very clear political purpose. This would kind of follow, if that's the case, that would follow a more general trend that an anthropologist by the name of John Bodley talks about. He talks about that he sees the whole as sort of human history, and the trend from initially hunting and gathering groups to more of like empire-based societies to now very commercially driven societies as a gradually more and more elite-driven process of accumulation of capital into fewer and fewer hands, or sorry, I should say accumulation of resources, and the elites kind of driving it all the way along and in the process doing a lot of harm to the environment. I think Bodley is a bit simplistic, to be honest, and takes it a little too far and doesn't consider some of the other kinds of trends that have happened. Having said that, there's a degree of truth to what he's saying, that a lot of the biggest alterations of the environment that we started to see 5,000 years ago, rivers being dammed, rivers being irrigated in different ways, canals, these are things that oftentimes came about in societies where you had an elite, where you had somebody at the top pushing for this and saying this will be good, often for functional reasons, like this irrigation project will help us farm better, which the people might have been on board for, and that's why they wanted the elite to guide them along it anyways. Other times more out of a, hey, help me secure my status kind of situation. In either case, with the Easter Island situation, there was a huge amount of pressure on the forests then. At the same time, the people who had colonized the island initially, the people who had initially landed, the indigenous people had brought with them certain non-native species, including rats, or at least we think they're non-native, and they chewed on the seeds of the trees and ultimately made it so that it was a lot harder, apparently, for the trees to germinate, a lower success rate of trees, seeds becoming trees. So as a result, you have too many trees being taken. You have a lot of trees being taken, but not a lot of replenishment. Eventually, you've essentially led to a deforested landscape and a lot of the large mammals apparently dying out from what we can tell from the fossil record. Some key themes here, right? Ideology, the power of the ideology, and hegemony. By ideology, I mean a specific belief system. Ideology oftentimes has the implication that an elite is sort of pushing that on others, although that's not always the case. Hegemony, though, from the theorist Gramsci, definitely has the connotation of sort of a way of thinking that becomes predominant, often of which is promulgated by people in power. You'll recall that I used the term eco-hegemony at the beginning of this class. And so arguably there was a hegemony here that drove this sort of deforestation activity driven by the elites. Again, it's not the only way to tell this story of deforestation on Easter Island, and I don't want to suggest that it is, but it is one of probably the most convincing scholarly stories that's been told about what probably happened here historically. And it's one in which we see politics and power having a very, very heavy role. So that was example number 2. So my number 2 didn't disappear. I just misnumbered the slide. So here's political ecology example number 3. I had you do a reading, but well, one of your options for reading, not everybody did it, because you could do this or the Shore-Monument reading, but was one on Ecuadorian oil politics. It was written in the 90s. Obviously, a lot of things have changed in Ecuador since the 90s. At the time, though, what was going on was you had some very interesting ecological politics going on with sort of nationally, the Ecuadorian government relying at the time very, very heavily on oil revenues to fund the government. And so pushing for and allowing for oil exploration and oil drilling in remote rural areas and indigenous areas as well. And one of the things that we found that you might have seen in there in the reading, if you did it, was that there was certainly effects from the oil exploration. The way it was being done at the time, it had a lot of leaks. It's a different scenario than, let's say, 2020s in Alaska or something, with a different set of regulatory frameworks and also a different set of technology 30 years later. But at the time, there was a whole lot of oil leaking going on. It was clearly having environmental impacts on local wildlife and things like that, and on people's water bodies. And you had people, this OPEP body of indigenous and local people who had bonded together and were really strongly opposing it. But then you also had other locals that were closer to the oil exploration who are actually supporting it strongly, and were accusing the other ones of sort of being disingenuous or not having any skin in the game, and like, why are you kind of trying to stop this? We're the ones right here. So we see a really key theme there of factionalism, right? Of people drawing lines in their communities or between communities, and the people that were closest to the environmental threat actually coming out in support. That may seem very shocking and surprising at first, that the people closest to the pollution would support the polluting industry, but that shouldn't really surprise us if we adapt not just a cultural ecology perspective of, oh man, why would you want to harm your own farming or your own hunting or your own fishing, but take a political ecology perspective, right? These are folk that are being increasingly drawn into the cash economy, that want and need cash to survive and to thrive. And this was a cash generating enterprise, right? This was something where they would get jobs as oil workers, among other things. And so there's lines of power there, right? And lines of money. And also to the US as well, right? This oil was being exported as well as being used locally. And so we can't think of that as an isolated Ecuadorian case study, but as one connected to the US oil market and other kinds of oil markets. Even though we produce a lot of our own oil locally, we also import a lot of our oil as well. Which has, of course, become a major, major issue in the last few weeks, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which itself would be, some have argued, is a pretty profound example of resource politics, right? In the way in which to secure land space that is good for oil pipelines, that itself has quite a bit of natural gas and also has quite a bit of agricultural land, pretty major wheat producing body. So some people see the conflict in the invasion of Ukraine as circulating around natural resource expansionism on the part of Putin. There's other things as well going on there. That's just one of them, but that certainly, I would say, is a factor. So as we can see, even at the level of war and invasion and human rights, environmental resources playing a huge role. Another example, where I used to live in Denton, Texas, it's the very northern end of what's called the Barnett Shale, which is a huge reservoir of natural gas. And of course, natural gas has had sort of a huge renaissance in the last couple of decades in the US, as power production has often shifted from oil towards natural gas, viewed as a cleaner fossil fuel alternative. That's a somewhat debated proposition for a number of reasons, including that it produces a lot of CH4, which produces a lot more, packs more per molecule, if you will, in terms of its greenhouse gas contribution. But in any case, natural gas has been seen by some as cleaner. Been a big push towards natural gas as power production. Barnett Shale has therefore been, as well as places like the Marcus Shale, is it called, or Marcellus Shale up in Pennsylvania. You have these areas in the US that have seen in the last 20 years a big push towards fracking. If you're not familiar with fracking, hydraulic fracturing is a type of technology that's to some degree new, or at least new in the sense of being widely used, where I'm going to explain it poorly. I do not work in this field, but essentially you're injecting a very, very concentrated liquid solution of several different chemicals into the ground, and then using it as part of your drilling process to access non-conventional sources of natural gas or oil, things that traditionally you couldn't get at just by sort of drilling straight down. So hydraulic fracturing has, people have a lot of different concerns with it. There's been some evidence to suggest in Oklahoma, for example, that it causes microquakes, small earthquakes or tremors. There's been a lot of anecdotal as well as some research to suggest a lot of health effects, including headaches nearby fracking sites, and as well as there's a lot of concerns with the mixtures being used being a trade secret, and therefore people not being sure what's being used, as some of this gets dumped as wastewater to the side of the wells. as well as just the noise and aesthetics of it, as you can see from this picture here. So that's fracking in a nutshell. Fracking is done all over North Texas, but especially in that, or on that shale, but particularly in Denton is one of the big areas where it's done, Denton County, which is rather shocking because Denton, as I've mentioned before, where I used to work, is a town and a community that views itself as an environmentally forward-thinking community, as a green community. Or at least the university certainly views itself that way. It's one of the kind of foremost chairs of environmental ethics and philosophy thinking is North Texas. And for years, the journal Environmental Ethics was hosted out of there. And they had Eugene Hargrave, one of the prominent beginners of sort of the environmental ethics and philosophy movement. So this is like a town where environmentalism runs deep. And yet you had this fracking. And so people started a huge campaign, the Frack Free Denton campaign, and it was successful ultimately in getting for a public resolution, is that the word? Ballot measure that the people took a vote on, and it wasn't a like decisive 90% victory. It was definitely, I think, more like 55-45 or 60-40, but they won. They got a fracking ban. And then the state government came in and overturned the fracking ban, ruling that this was a matter for state regulatory agencies and not for local city governments. And so Texas state government essentially overturned the fracking ban. I mean, it was in theory for the whole state, but essentially people viewed it as targeted specifically towards Denton, which had just passed a fracking ban. And as a result, fracking continues in Denton. Some city officials try to limit its impact, for example, by tinkering with the laws that they can affect, such as setback limits, like, oh, you have to be a certain amount of feet from a playground or from a home. But on a fundamental level, fracking continues. And indeed, many people have surface rights to their land, but they don't have subsurface rights, mineral rights, which may not come up very often for you, but comes up for farmers and suburbanites in Denton, where their lands, they have surface rights, but not mineral rights. And so gas companies have often claimed legally, through legal mechanisms, claimed the rights to the oil or natural gas under their land. And so therefore they can say, well, farmer, we get to set up a well here. And also you need to make sure that your fence is open during normal hours of operation so we can get to our well. You can't like restrict our access. That's our oil or natural gas. So it's a big political issue, to say the least. We see very strong power differentials between landowners and outside companies. Some have presented it as an environmental justice issue. The community, to be rather blunt, having lived there, it's not notably more ethnically or racially diverse than its neighbors, really. It's not notably more impoverished. It's a little bit poorer than other areas around it, but not notably so. So it's not sort of a classic environmental racism or classism issue, but one could argue that it's an environmental justice issue because there's such clear power differential between the local community and many of their sentiments, and as well as specific landowners and versus sort of the state and corporate powers that have pushed forward the fracking. A final example is the Tedi Mine in Papua New Guinea. This is in the highlands of New Guinea. It's a great book by Joel Robbins called Becoming Sinners. I strongly recommend it. It's mainly a great book for its anthropology of Christianity content and how a group called the Urapmin converted very rapidly. But it's also good because in the introduction, he talks about the controversy that rose over a proposed mine, and basically the group of people called the Urapmin being upset because the mine wasn't put near their community. It was put near another community, and they viewed that as a result of themselves being sinful. And you might say, why would a community want a mine right by them, particularly when it's really extensive mining in a less regulated landscape than what we have here in the States? And even here in the States, sometimes you get some pretty intense mining operations. So it's much less regulated, and it's had significant environmental impacts. Patricia Townsend, nice person, who wrote one of the readings that you did earlier in the semester, she does fieldwork up in, or at least used to, in New Guinea. And she showed pictures one time in this presentation I went to of basically huge soil wash-off tailings wash out, right? Like basically the residue of the mining operations that then washes down the stream and super acidifies the soil where people are growing sago palm, which we heard about this in another reading by Sophie Chow, right? Sago palm is this like really important key crop that people grow. And their farms getting kind of wrecked to the point where you're not able to grow sago there anymore, even though that's like a key crop for the community and has been for centuries because of the mine tailings. So if you happen to have the poor fortune to be in the wake of these mine tailings when they pass down the river, your land getting pretty wrecked. So why would you want a mine in a scenario like that? Well, part of it is that, we can now see the environmental effects now that the mine's gone in, of course. But the other thing to consider is that we're talking about areas where people have only within the last few decades been exposed to a market economy, but are increasingly part of it and would like to have capital and would like to have cash and funds to buy consumer goods and to survive and thrive, especially in a situation where land has been somewhat more encroached on, would like to have that capital, but are often in sort of economically impoverished areas from the perspective of capitalism. Of course, people can meet basic subsistence needs all day with food and water and things from their local environment, but wanting to have a cash income to participate in broader markets, and so the mine being part of that. So people, so to speak, inviting polluting industries into their communities, and we can't think of that as people being just ill-informed, but also recognize that there are bigger forces at play. And we could multiply examples until the cows come home. In the Palmer reading, they talked about soil erosion in a study that was done by Blakey et al. Of soil erosion across the many different communities, and finding that up to this point in the 90s, we'd often assumed that soil erosion was either an environmental problem, i.e. that's just a bad place to farm, right? That's kind of when I was taking environmental science classes, even in the 2010, in the late 2000s. You heard people express, oh, well, farming in such and such area, it's just, it's bad soil there. Of course, there's erosion. Or people would look at soil erosion sometimes as a knowledge problem, right? We need to educate farmers about no-till, which is a way of tilling your land that causes less soil erosion. But the Blakey study suggested that, a big problem with erosion is it's a government problem. People that are small farmers especially in the global south, and that suddenly get heavily taxed by an outside government as communities go from being local bands, tribes, or chiefdoms, and then getting brought into a larger country now that's considering them part of their territory and taxing them. Well, when people are taxed, they then start to farm their lands more intensively, right? It is no longer profitable to sort of do a classic Swidden, really small scale horticultural plot, or maybe some as careful of attention to certain kinds of terraced agriculture, or just in general, you're farming more intensively, the same land more often, or more of a cash crop situation, partly because you're trying to feed the tax beast, right, that you're getting from the government. Another example, the Bailey study of the Amazon, where in the 90s, they found that as much as 12% of the pristine Amazon rainforest had been extensively modified, clearly when you looked at the actual tree cover, by cultural forces, by people having planted certain kinds of crops there. We've talked about that more, right? The idea of sort of that wilderness is, the way we sometimes think of wilderness is perhaps not very accurate, or at least it's not accurate across the board. There are places that had relatively little human impact, but there are a lot of places that we think of as wilderness that definitely had people there and definitely had a lot of people impact. And that there is far less empty land, quote unquote, than colonialists wanted to think there was. It was a very convenient narrative. But anyways, I digress, of course. But the point also is that not only that, so wilderness itself is sort of a political invention of a certain sort of thinking of the landscape, but also when we think of issues like deforestation in the Amazon and rampant issues that super affect endangered species, have huge biodiversity impacts. Well, what we consider the problem oftentimes determines what we consider the solution. And so oftentimes early on, environmental groups moving into the area, or more environmentally forward-thinking governments, thought that the problem was people and that the solution was fencing. The solution was sort of getting people out of the areas that were most ecologically vulnerable. Don't farm there, don't do slash and burn there. A contrary perspective started to be espoused in the 80s of, maybe what we really need is indigenous people with actual land rights to their land, making sure that communities that have customarily been there for centuries have formal legal title. Because what we have is timber companies moving into, for example, in Indonesia, moving into areas where indigenous people don't have legal tenure. So the timber company can come in and extract a bunch of trees, or a ranching company can move in. So maybe what we really need is better land rights. Maybe it's not so much an environmental problem or a knowledge problem so much as it is a legal/political problem. And that's a debate that could go back and forth. But it's because there's people that would say, well, even under different hands, just because somebody is ethnically indigenous doesn't mean they're going to sort of avoid market forces and not also overfarm/overlog their land, which was Kent Redford's point in a famous The Ecologically Noble Savage paper that he wrote, which was both, in my opinion, pretty offensive and controversial, but he was trying to make a point about these assumptions that if indigenous people had legal title, then automatically all the environmental problems would be solved. So, but anyways, the point is with the Amazon, with tropical forests in general, is it just an environmental problem or is it a political problem? I think it's pretty clear that it's both. On a more hopeful note, right, political ecology doesn't always have to be depressing case studies. Let's talk, for example, about Eleanor Shorman, the reading that some of you did. In that reading, I say it's hopeful, and I want to explain what I mean by that. It's not entirely hopeful. She talks about the fact that Mississippi Delta farmers historically have been really resistant to sort of quote unquote environmental programs. And so when, ag extensions or others have come in, researchers from nearby cities or something and been promoting certain kinds of like, hey, do more targeted fertilizer, use less pesticide, or maybe I'm not sure if this is exactly what was being promoted in this case study, but things like low till or minimum till, right? Instead of like deep tilling of the land, instead do kind of a lighter tilling and a more selective process that leaves more residue, which means less erosion, right? There was all these attempts to try to like get people to be more environmentally minded in their farming, partly because the Mississippi, gosh, has just got tons and tons of water pollution, has for decades, causing things like the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico that we've talked about. So when it was framed that way, there was just a whole lot of resistance, and outsiders saw this as, oh, these anti-environmental rural communities in the South, right? Eleanor Sherman Neumann says, that's really an unfortunate kind of phrasing. Yes, people have not liked environmental policies. People have not liked when, for example, the EPA has come in and tried to regulate how much fertilizer or pesticide people can use, tried to regulate those quote non-point pollution sources, have been resistant to the environmental programs. But Sherman-Neumann points out, that's not to say that people can't do environmentally positive things with their farming. And indeed, the last couple of decades have seen a lot of people starting to adapt more environmentally beneficial forms of farming that pollute less. And in another article, she calls this middle out conservation, as opposed to top down conservation, where the EPA comes in and says, you're polluting too much, farm this way. Instead, she says, a lot of what we're seeing be successful now is that when like the most successful farmers in an area, sort of the local elites, as it were, when they start forming these sort of farmer co-op associations where they themselves are promoting more environmentally conscious kind of methods that might require some cost, definitely, but which will reduce the pollution load, and approach it more from a business perspective, business people talking to business people, farmers talking to farmers, that those kinds of organizations forming in these communities, these middle out organizations, have been a lot more effective than top down from the government. And you have farmers of their own volition adopting programs, ways of farming, technologies that will allow them to pollute less. So, one of the points she's making, and I think it's a really good point, is that there's a lot of politics when we talk about environmental programs. She says a lot of that resistance historically was resistance in the area traditionally to federal intervention period that goes back all the way back to the Reconstruction era, right, and the Civil War era. But strong resistance to outside federal control. It was less about views about the environment and a lot more about views about government as an outside force. And we can hate that or like that or whatever, but it's a reality culturally in those communities. And that if you want to do good conservation, coming in with a big old badge and a big old legislative hammer from the federal government is probably not the way you're going to get a lot of buy-in, and that instead it's from local people developing their own sorts of methods and supporting those wherever you can, right? Funneling funds and resources to those more local bodies that can do a lot more because they're not sort of bound up with these state versus local versus federal political dramas. Final point I wanted to talk about today. Well, it's actually not the final point. I have several more points. So I wanted to talk a little bit now about, so that was kind of more of a hopeful case study. I want to talk now about NEPA. So I had you do my 15-minute career preparation readings that I have you do each week. This one was just a simple flow chart. I hope you paid attention to it. This is trying to help you understand how things happen when NEPA comes into play. So NEPA is a really, speaking of political ecology, speaking of how politics and economy affect environmental things, NEPA is one of the most powerful environmental forces in America today. And indeed, there are similar policies in a lot of other places as well, but we're focusing here on the US where most of us live and where most of us will work. So I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I actually have to stop the video here.